He's not late because of the car wasn't here on time. We have to get the microphone on. D, 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 D. Do they have Jeopardy in Germany? D, 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 D. D, 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 D.
Yeah. There is one. There is
perfect.
One.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Carlos, did you do that? Yeah, there we go. Ding.
Hello.
Perfect timing. Welcome here. Thank you. Please have a seat.
Thank you.
How many years has Jeopardy been on TV? I think 50. There's an amazing story. So, I think you joined Airbnb the same time Uber the same time Olivier joined Airbnb. Was that 2012?
Yeah, exactly. I joined Uber in 2012.
And how many employees were there then?
There were 70 employees globally and 3-4 outside the US.
So you were the third Uber employee outside of the US?
Yeah, pretty much.
That's amazing.
Pretty much.
And today, how many employees?
So today we have 2.2 thousand people globally.
Yeah, and I think 1,500 and Priceline Group 13,000. So I guess there's still somewhere to go. Same question. When you joined Uber, did you have any? Did you really think it would get this big, this fast?
No, I don't think so. I mean, what I knew and what everyone knew was that the opportunity was just massive.
Yes.
The market was just massive for transportation, and there was a clear problem to solve, which is, I think, what excited me.
Yeah.
And Uber was about technology, so it was about kind of pushing technology in a world that's never really seen any form of technology. So the opportunity was massive. Now, of course, there's an extremely important execution challenge.
Yeah. The thing that people ask me, like, what do I think the most amazing thing about Uber is? And I use the expression digital wallet, but put your credit card in your mobile app and that's it. But it's very difficult to get thousands and thousands of customers to trust a brand to put their credit card in a mobile app. How did you combine technology with that human thing called trust to get to such a critical mass? It's amazing.
That's a good point. And actually, you observe that it's very dependent on countries. So you see some countries are more or less, and people from certain countries are more or less willing and used to put their credit card details into an app. I think what helped a lot in the case of Uber is that transportation by nature is extremely social. So it's about people moving out, going to the restaurant, going to a club, and this is when they have the opportunity to talk about Uber to some of their friends. And so actually the best advocates for us are the users, and they're usually the one that have been able to convince their friends to download the app and put their credit card details.
And would you also agree that timing had a lot to do with Uber's success, because we needed Amazon and eBay and PayPal and Apple to do some things first, or do you think this could have happened?
I think what made all of that possible is the very high mobile phone penetration. So as you know, there's no website for Uber. It's just about pushing a button on an app and getting a car to come. And so I think this is really what made Uber possible. And
how many rides were there in the world yesterday booked through Uber, approximately?
So we did in 2014 140 million rides throughout the year.
140 million rides. Wow.
Yes, and the run rate we've shared at the end of 2014, the number we discussed publicly was around 1 million rides a day at that time.
Wow. I saw the New Year's Eve statistics. They were incredible. How many people booked between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning? It's phenomenal. India is Uber's #2 market, and it's huge. A lot of people think that when they get a new service, they have to do one market at a time, or there's differences. What have you learned when India is the second biggest market, America's the first, all these countries? What's the common themes that Uber has learned for success that you could share with these travel companies?
I think the common theme we've observed is that in most places around the world, the taxi industry is extremely regulated for good reasons. At least, you know, a taxi by definition is a vehicle that's going to carry unknown people that step in an unknown car. And so there was a need for very strict regulation. Now, what we've discovered is that suddenly, when you put a platform in between the person that wants to move around and the driver, the need for regulation is very different. And so what I described around the mobile app and what the technology enables is enabling us to bring safer and more reliable options pretty much everywhere.
So to explain it, so the brand Uber with a technology platform mobile increases trust between unknown passenger and unknown driver.
It increases trust, it makes the experience safer, more reliable, and potentially more affordable. So what's happening is that by putting this tech platform in between the user and the driver, you help the driver make more trips per hour. And if he can do more trips per hour, that means that those trips can technically be cheaper.
And for example, on safety, like especially for female drivers alone, they can share the progress of the ride with somebody.
So safety is one of our core priorities, of course, and the way we think about safety is in a number of ways. First, in terms of who we put on the platform. So who are the drivers? We're going to check, we are going to ask for background checks, insurance, we're going to keep track of the ID of the person. And then once the person is driving on the Uber network, we have the rating mechanism, which means that we can track very closely any behavior, any unsafe behavior, for instance. And then we're constantly innovating and trying to push new options like the one you described about the ability to share a trip with your friends and family.
So if, I'll ask the question for the driver and then again for the passenger, but if a driver rating gets consistently too low, do they get removed from the network?
So we take the rating extremely seriously. Before getting removed, there's a number of steps we take, which is about essentially coaching that driver. So we're going to look, and because we get a lot of feedback, we're going to look and try to provide some advice in terms of what went wrong. And usually what we observe is that through all those very specific advice we're able to share, then the rating goes up. If it was not to go up, if there's some serious concerns around safety or anything along those lines, of course, we take that extremely seriously, and so we'd remove the driver right away.
And what happens to the crazy passengers that consistently get a low rating from the drivers?
Well,
you can't bring them into school and discipline. What happens to them?
First of all, I'd say it's extremely uncommon that riders don't have good ratings. Like drivers, they don't spend their day wondering whether they're going to put 1 star or 5 stars. So I think this tool is mainly used to identify kind of wrongdoing and wrong behaviors on the side of rider, which we use in case of an incident happening. So whenever you have a serious incident, I think it's an interesting data point to look at. But I would say drivers are not in the business of wondering at every trip whether this guy was friendly or not.
So I asked Olivier this question. Do you think there's been like a mutual benefit of Airbnb and Uber growing side by side? Do you think it would have been as big, each company alone, if the other one wasn't growing next to it?
I don't know. It's a difficult question. What I see is that those two companies have something in common, which is that there's been a consumer appetite that's probably gone faster than the mindset of lawmakers. And so no surprise that Airbnb and Uber have both been facing in many cities in the world some regulatory hurdles. And I think this is the common theme that there probably is between the two companies, on top of being in the business of trying to mutualize somehow some of the assets we have.
Because I grew up in New York City, and I remember in the 1960s, if it rained, there was never a taxi. And I used to say, "Mommy, how come there's no taxis?" And she said, "Because the regulators won't let them increase their price." Not all these regulations were good, but they've just been there. So how do you sort out, like, if there is such a thing, good regulations that affect safety and things, and bad ones that have just been there forever, lining somebody's pocket?
So I think there's a number of principles which we think are critical in terms of how regulations are designed. The first one is choice and competition. So you want to have a regulation that's going to encourage competition in the sector. And this is not what's happening in many cities around the world with the taxi industry. The second thing, of course, is rider safety and driver safety. So how do you design rules that make sure that every single ride is as safe as it can be? And the third aspect, of course, is how do you foster economic activity, taxation, and how do you essentially create job opportunities for many people that are currently unemployed or precarious situations.
Yeah, we'll get to that demand thing in a minute. So there was a recent Wall Street Journal article. I think you were quoted in it. I think the title was something that Uber is giving compromise a try or something like that. Do you think that's a fair assessment or a misstatement?
I think the fair assessment is that Uber is trying to do a better job at explaining what its story is.
Right.
And if I look back, what I observe is that unfortunately 99% of the coverage you get on Uber is around Uber competing with taxis, when actually there's some way more interesting themes that we hardly hear about around mobility. And I think Uber's biggest competitor is not taxis, it's car ownership. And to give you a very simple example.
So explain, when you do that, like we're in Berlin now, and you're based out of Paris, right?
Mostly, yes.
Yeah. Explain the difference of what's happening in Paris versus what's happening here in Berlin.
Sure. So when I joined Uber in Paris in 2012, there were 1,000 limo drivers in the city of Paris. That is approximately the same number of cars there is today of limo drivers there are today in Berlin. Today, so 2.5 years later, there is in Paris around 10,000 limo drivers, and as many taxis as there used to be.
So number of taxis stayed the same, but the number of limousine drivers increased 10 times.
Exactly.
So Uber actually helped create demand.
Yes.
And grow the economy.
And so what you realize, like if I give you a very interesting example around San Francisco, when Uber launched in San Francisco, the size of the taxi and limo market as a whole was $120 million a year of gross bookings. 120.
Yeah.
Today, Uber on its own in San Francisco is more than $500 million of gross bookings.
So this sector grew 4 times the size.
And the reason why this sector is growing so fast is very simple, is that most of the individual trips that happen in a car, they are actually happening with people that are driving their own car. And that market is massive, and this is a structural trend that's going to continue and potentially accelerate.
And what's going on in Berlin, one of the world's great capitals?
So what's going on in Berlin, and frankly all across Germany, is that the regulation is extremely strict, and like there's a lot of hurdles for people to start a business of transporting people around. So if tomorrow I want to come to Berlin and I want to drive people around, it's extremely difficult. It's going to take a lot of time. There's going to be regulation around the car. Am I employed? What, do I have enough financial guarantee? There's a rule around return to garage. So every time I drop off a passenger, I'll have to go back to my garage. And so there are a lot of rules that essentially prevent the sector from growing.
So, but if I had the regulator here and I said, so in Paris, the number of drivers increased 10 times and they're all earning money and delivering customers a service. The economy, this economic sector in San Francisco grew 4 times. Why are you preventing growth in Berlin? He and she would argue with me, right?
I think what most people would tell you, and most of the people that are arguing against innovations such as Uber would probably tell you, we are feared that the taxis are not going to be happy with that change and are going to lose business. And this is where we're trying to do a better job at educating, just like Olivier said, at sharing data and showing that actually it's definitely not about Uber taking share in that industry. It's quite the contrary. And when people stop using their own car, guess what? They'll use more taxis than they have ever used in their life.
So 2 quick questions. So if we happen to be invited, Pierre and Philip, to sit here again next year, 1 year from now, what do you think will happen in Germany? What do you think the difference will be in Germany?
We'll see, future will tell, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a service that's even more reliable, safer than it is today. And for that to happen, it means being able to grow the market.
Yeah. So you talked about, Uber does a lot of research. So if a car has like a 24-hour per day life, how many hours per day are most cars not used that are individually owned?
So today in the world, you have 1 billion cars on the planet. 1 billion.
Billion with a B for boy. Yeah.
That are utilized 4% of the time.
Wow.
That's an asset base of $20 trillion. It's more than the US GDP, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the issue. Right. And so we live in a world where it makes less and less sense to see all those cars parked in the streets doing nothing for most of the day and just moving around one person one time a day.
So it's a very green argument as well.
It's a very green argument, and we are definitely observing that transition, and my guess is that this transition will definitely accelerate.
Yeah. I think the name of the business I mentioned to you in German is Drive Now, where you can take your app out, BMW does it, the car can be parked anywhere legally, maybe sometimes not, and you open it with your app and the key is inside and you drive it and get charged by the minute.
Yeah.
So are these, could these be kinds of businesses that Uber will also get into, and do you see this also growing?
So the first thing I'd say is that very often I hear people talking to me about those sort of businesses and telling me, oh shit, London, is it a competition? And actually, I quite say the opposite. I love those businesses and we want to see them emerge.
It's because they're all using this excess capacity.
And also because they are accelerating the transition towards fewer individual cars. You know, people stop using their car if they have a bunch of reliable options that match all the needs they might have. And so, you know, someone that wants to use a car for 3 hours one afternoon, he's definitely going to be happier with a product like that than taking an Uber. And so if you can create an ecosystem of transport options that covers the whole spectrum, then you start to have people wondering why they need to have a car. And I think that's why we're super interested about those sort of businesses and happy to see them emerge. Now, we're not in the same business, and I don't think at this stage there's so many things we can do on continuing to improve the Uber experience that I think we're really focused on that.
This week it was announced Uber acquired a mapping company called Jakarta. And I guess before this, you've been very reliant on Google and other mapping technologies. Just big picture, what does this enable Uber to do for its drivers and for its customers that it couldn't do before?
So first, Uber is in the business of helping people move around cities. So mapping technology is very core to providing a reliable, safe experience. At the moment, today, we use a mixture of internal technologies, so Uber technologies, and third-party technologies such as Apple, Google. And I think this acquisition of Jakarta is just about fostering our internal capabilities.
Is there a particular new innovation you guys are thinking about that you want to do, but you just haven't been able to do it yet because technology isn't there?
I think we are all about...
I mean, I know you're not in the product team, so I don't mean to...
I'm not the product team. What I can confirm, though, is that Uber is all about innovation. So we're doing experiments all over the world, and you've probably seen a lot of those that we're doing in cities. And so we keep looking for ideas. Now, at the same time, there's so much more to do on what we focused on, which is providing a reliable, safe experience to as many people as possible that, frankly, it keeps us super busy, and there's still a lot to do.
I've been an Uber customer forever, but even now I'm having difficulty. I travel 175 days a year, all the different services. So I get black car and black SUV is easy, and I get taxi, but you have lots of different products in between, Pop and X. Can you summarize all these different products now?
Yeah, I think we are all about choice, and we want to make sure that there's a price point for each person that want to move around.
So all the different products are slightly different price points?
Yeah, it's about the price point difference.
Okay.
So you'll have lower cost options, and those are either called UberX, Uber Pop, and I think that depends a bit on cities. And Uber is a business, I can touch on that later on, but it's a business where the cities are really empowered to make decisions. It's really a local business, which is why you might, have a product in the US that's called UberX, that's called Uber Pop in...
Are they the same, basically, Pop and X? Because I think in Paris, they're two different choices.
Yeah. So the reason also for that diversity of products has also to do with the diversity of regulations around the world.
Okay.
So in the example of Paris, with the UberX product, there are very strict regulations about the length of the car and actually the horsepower. So in Paris, they are telling, hey, if you want to be a limo, you have to pollute at least X amount, otherwise it's not a limo. So that's why the lower cost product we could provide within the existing framework was UberX. And then we decided to push a different product that's more of a peer-to-peer product that's even more lower cost.
Talk about, I think you have a relatively new service where you will get two different passengers who don't know each other together to share a ride. but it's done with technology.
Yeah.
So there.
So that's a service that's called Uber Pool, which is very impressive, like exceptional, I have to say, which is about enabling two people that are traveling along the same direction that don't know each other to share the ride in real time. And this is possible when you reach a certain scale. So when there are enough people in a city that move around with this app, then you start to be able to match some of the trajectories. And then you exemplify the car savings I was discussing. So you're taking further cars off the road. So it's an extremely interesting product.
Yeah. We talked at the one extreme about using the self-driving and renting by the minute. And then at the other extreme, you just reminded me of BlaBlaCar that helps people and drivers going long distances. Do you see eventually consolidation in this space? Or I mean, isn't it a little unlikely you have so many different players, each with a slightly different business model, using cars more efficiently?
It's difficult to say. What I see is that all those businesses, they are just surfing the same trend, which is about fewer cars and shared resources. It's difficult to predict what will the future be made of on that respect.
Google's an investor in Uber, and they're famous, at least from headlines point of view, with the driverless car. Are there any discussions going on between Google and Uber about the business model around a driverless car?
So unfortunately, you'd have to ask some of my colleagues in SF, because I'm not in those discussions if ever they happen. So I'm not I can't really comment on that.
But I have seen in Google Maps when you're doing directions.
That's correct.
We have walking, driving, mass transit, and I'm starting to see some markets or get Uber, and then it would be like a deep dive where the Uber app would know your destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're very focused on making the experience as seamless as possible, and in that context, it makes a lot of sense to integrate the Uber option in all the transit apps that kind of make sense for consumers.
Yeah.
So we have that with Google Maps, we have that with other transit apps in different cities in the world.
What's more challenging, acquiring more customers or acquiring more drivers?
I think it depends on cities, but I'd say in most, like across Europe, it's typically acquiring drivers.
It's more difficult.
It's more difficult, and usually it's slowed down a lot by the regulation. So, you know, if it takes 4 months to become a driver, you have to pay a ton of money, you have to show that, you know, there are even countries where, you know, you're unemployed, you want to become a professional driver, and we're going to ask you to show your bank account to prove that you have 10K euros on your bank account.
Yeah.
So all those regulations very often are slowing down the growth of the market, which means that it's becoming hard and hard to acquire new drivers, to bring new drivers onto the platform.
And what about alternate new payment technologies? Obviously, Apple is getting a lot of headlines, but right now your credit card is the dominant. Do you see that evolving over time?
So we actually offer multiple options. So you can pay with PayPal, for instance.
Right.
We have in the US an integration with Google Wallet, now with Apple Pay. And I think basically what we want to achieve is make sure that we can bring as many options to the consumers as possible. So if there's any option that makes sense and that's popular in the market, it is definitely something we'd be looking to integrate to the app.
But pay by cash does not seem to be one of those options.
No, I don't think so. And, you know, part of what makes the Uber experience
you don't need the cash.
Seamless is the cashless. And you know, that's also an important aspect when we were touching on safety. When you look at, you know, a taxi ride, for instance, you realize that a lot of the risk exposure in a way is around people stepping out of the taxi, going to the ATM to take some cash.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to make the experience as seamless as possible, but also as safe as possible. And the cashless is definitely part of that.
Yeah. To use an Amazon analogy, in the early days, everyone said Amazon sold books. That's what put them on the map, so to speak. And I remember at the time when the discussion started that Amazon would sell things other than books, there was a big debate. And now, a few years later, we don't even hardly remember when Amazon only sold books. Is it possible that what the book was to Amazon, the car is to Uber, and one day we'll sit here on stage and almost can't remember when the only thing Uber sold was rides?
I don't know, why not? What I see, though, is that the book industry as a whole has been going down when the industry and the business we're in is just exploding. So I feel like for now it's definitely more structural than the book might have been.
Which industry is going down? Sorry?
The physical books.
Of course.
Of course. So that's an important difference. Whereas we're in an industry where on top of penetrating a market, we have this market of people starting to share cars on those sort of platforms that is going up. And as I said, the opportunity is massive. See, most of the trips are happening with individual cars.
But your platform's amazing. There's lots of things you could use with it besides rides, right? So even though it's enormous, you know, if you have other demand you could fill and you don't do it, then somebody else could one day.
Yeah,
right?
it's a fair point. I think what we've observed with Uber is that the business has been scaling so fast that it remains a challenge for us to deliver on our core product all what we want to deliver on. And so back to my earlier point, there's still so many things we'd love to do and where we feel we're resource constrained that they remain a priority to us.
Interesting. So to wrap up, maybe you could put a consulting hat on for a minute. A record amount of people come to ITB every year, and it seems like the change never stops. If you were a small or individual or a more traditional company, you know, how do they continue to be relevant and to keep up with all this change like Airbnb and Uber are driving? You know, what bit of advice could you give them?
I think one of the advice I would give is definitely the focus that needs to happen on the user experience. When you look at a lot of the successful tech startups from the recent decade, you observe that a lot of what made them successful is an experience that was entirely seamless for the user. And having that as your core priority is usually what's going to help you to...
Right, but not just the experience of when you're traveling, right? It's also the searching, the shopping, the buying.
For sure.
So it's like, that's why I say the product experience is bigger than just consuming the inventory.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Hopefully we can have a follow-up discussion a year from now. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierre Gore-Coty, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Good job. Thank you.